So, there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger happy after the end of the Cold War? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And of course, the third strategic mistake that the West made was to continue to try and dominate the world. I think most ordinary citizens in the West are not aware of what your leaders, what your diplomats are trying to do in trying to preserve Western control of the world. And in often using methods and principles that in theory go against Western principles. Okay?
大家好，今天要分享的是新加坡顶尖外交家马凯硕在欧洲哲学艺术节的完整演讲节选。这场面向全西方精英的公开对话，直面西方200多年的全球霸权，撕开了他们长久以来的自我美化与双重标准。整场演讲没有偏激情绪，全部依托国际法、真实战争史实、全球人口数据、国际机构运行现状展开剖析。他清晰梳理西方犯下3大致命战略错误，冷战后陷入历史终结论的自我麻痹，30年来频繁绕开国际法发动战争，长久垄断 IMF、世界银行2大全球经济机构的领导席位。同时，他也客观解读中华文明的复兴不是威胁，只是回归人类历史常态，点明一个多元文明并存的新世界正在到来。马凯硕数十年穿梭东西方外交场，看透大国博弈底层逻辑，所有观点都有亲身经历作为支撑。下面我们一起来看这场直面西方的硬核演讲。
Good morning, everyone. This is my first time at the How the Light Gets In Festival and my first speech. So you can see I'm very nervous. But anyway, as you know, in the West, especially in Americans and British, you start the talk, you make a joke. I come from Asia, and in Asia, we always begin with an apology. But this is actually a genuine apology. And I sincerely want to apologize to you all if my talk makes you feel uncomfortable. And the problem here is that if I don't make you uncomfortable, and if I don't take you out of your comfort zones, you won't understand the world that's coming. The world that is coming is so far outside your comfort zones that you really got to, in a sense, suffer a bit of pain if you're going to understand it. So the way I propose to organize my remarks today is to try and give you a glimpse of the new world that's emerging. And I'll talk in the first part about how we are seeing, firstly, of course, the end of the era of Western domination of world history. The West has had a very good run. 200 years plus of global domination, which is fun. But that's over. And it's important to understand why it's over. What happened? What did the West do wrong? And then the second part about basically what you're seeing is a new multi-civilizational world where you're seeing the return of other civilizations. And that's, of course, going to change the texture and chemistry of our world significantly. And I'm going to focus, although in that section, mostly on China, because China is now the leading edge of new world. And if you don't understand China, you don't understand new world is coming, right? And then I'm going to talk about what you might see, therefore, as we move into this new world. What kind of scenarios can we expect? How will we stumble into this new world that's coming? So let me then begin by talking about why the West has lost its way. And I want to just begin by making a slightly provocative statement that the West has, in global terms, become a lonely, narcissistic civilization, self-absorbed in itself, very happy with itself. And therefore, with this narcissism, has blinded itself to the mistakes that it has made in dealing with the rest of the world. And I want to begin the story in some ways with the end of the Cold War in 1990. Because I'm sure you all remember how the West celebrated, how happy the West was that it defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. And the West thought, hey, we have arrived. And you even believed, this is amazing. Almost everyone in the West believed that you had reached the end of history. Hooray! We don't have to struggle anymore. We've made it. We made it to the top. We've achieved these liberal democratic societies, which are the best societies in the world. We succeeded. We have made it. The rest of you, the rest of the world, you got to struggle. We don't have to struggle. And one statistic that I'm surprised that so few in the West are aware of is that the West only makes up 12% of the world's population. 12%. 88% lives outside the West. And the West crazily assumed at that moment of history, when it reached the end of history, that the rest of the West would come and become replicas of the West. Copy you, follow you, and become like you. I'm sure you'll all agree that that's a somewhat arrogant assumption on the part of the West. But that arrogance dominated the worldview of all the Western intellectuals at that time. I know it so well because by an accident of history, I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92, and I drowned in that arrogance that I could feel about how the West had arrived and succeeded, and the rest of you poor chaps, get used to it, adjust to it, move on. So the reason why that arrogance at that point was a major strategic mistake, because that arrogance put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the other civilizations decide to wake up. So you close your eyes when the rest of the world was waking up. And remember, China had started its 4 modernizations program in 1979, and by 1989, 1990 was gaining a lot of momentum. And then India also woke up around the early 1990s. As a result of crisis, by the way, in both cases, China went through major crisis and said, okay, enough is enough. Time for us to get sensible and do the right thing. India went through major crisis and said, enough is enough. Let's do the right thing. And of course, what you've seen since then, in the case of the Chinese civilization has been around for 4,000 years. And the last 40 years of economic and social development in China have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. And the West said, it cannot be. They're not like us. They cannot be succeeding, right? Because you assume to succeed, you must be liberal democratic. So that clearly, that's why I think the end of the history moment was a disastrous moment for the West, because it put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the rest was waking up. But there was another major strategic mistake that the West made once it felt that, okay, we're number one, we can run the world, we can do what we want to do. And of course, many in the West believe that the most peaceful, law-abiding civilization in the world is Western civilization. But if you look at the data, the West became trigger happy and started getting involved in wars after wars. The last 30 over years, the West decided that the best way to spread liberty is to bomb cities. Bombing is the best way to spread democracy and liberalism. And the rest of the world noticed that this happened, that you had become trigger happy. Of course, it started in the late 1990s, when, of course, you thought you were doing the right thing, you're trying to protect the people of the former Yugoslavia. And the way you do that is by bombing Belgrade. And incidentally, curiously, many in the West believe that the West, of course, always abides by international law. The bombing of Belgrade was a violation of international law. International law makes it very clear. This is Western international law. 1945 UN rules-based order, Western international law, that says that the use of force is justified when it's either an act of self-defense or if it's authorized by the UN Security Council. The bombing of Belgrade was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by the UN Security Council, and therefore illegal. And it's interesting because the West always believes in the rule of law. But I can tell you, when a Western prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia tried just to say, should we ask the question whether the bombing of Belgrade was legal or illegal, the amount of pressure put on that prosecutor was phenomenal. Again, many in the West didn't notice this, but the rest of the world noticed this. And that, of course, that trigger-happy strain didn't stop at Yugoslavia. It carried on with the Iraq War in 2003. And clearly, that war was illegal. It was not an act of self-defense, not authorized by UN Security Council. And by the way, I know perfectly well it wasn't authorized by the UN Security Council because I was a member of the UN Security Council myself, personally, for 2 years. I watched the debates and I watched whether or not the United States and UK pushing very hard to get the rest of the world to agree the time had come to remove Saddam Hussein. The rest of the world said, no, this is not legal. And by the way, curiously, the one interesting thing about the Iraq War that is worth noting and remembering is that two of the best friends of the United States and the United Kingdom, two countries called France and Germany, actually opposed the war and did say to US and UK, this is a mistake, don't do this, this is a mistake. And of course, they were shoved aside because there was total conviction that what the US was doing in spreading democracy was the right thing. What stunned me, by the way, sometimes little stories that give you an indication of how people think. I thought that this desire for war was probably limited to a tribe that's called the neocons in America, by the way, who always believe that the best solution is American military intervention. But I happened to be in New York in 2002, attending a wonderful lunch in a very exclusive club in New York. And I was sitting next to a very successful American businessman. And as we were sat down for lunch, we were being served wine. And when the waiter came to pour wine, this gentleman asked the waiter, is this French wine? The waiter said, yes. He said, I'm not touching French wine. They're opposing our war in Iraq. That, to me, was a huge wake-up call. Gosh, this desire for war is so deep, so entrenched in the West. But Iraq war, as you know, was not the last war. there could have been lessons learned. War crimes were committed in Iraq. And at the same time, subsequently, when you intervene in Libya, right, that was also a major war crime. I mean, Gaddafi was a dictator. Let's be clear about that. There's no doubt that he was a dictator. But under him, the Libyan people had the best lives of anybody in Africa. They had guaranteed income, guaranteed healthcare, guaranteed education, guaranteed peace. They had good lives. And then you bombed Gaddafi, the country collapsed, the West created a failed state, and just walked away. And the rest of the world noticed. So, I mean, there's so little reflection in the West of how many people have you killed? How many lives have you destroyed by becoming so trigger happy after the end of the Cold War? But I can tell you that was a mistake that prevented you also from seeing what was happening. And of course, the third strategic mistake that the West made was to continue to try and dominate the world. I think most ordinary citizens in the West are not aware of what your leaders, what your diplomats are trying to do in trying to preserve Western control of the world. And in often using methods and principles that in theory go against Western principles, okay? I mean, for example, you believe in meritocracy. You believe that if anyone should be chosen to run an organization, it should be the best possible person. It doesn't matter whether he's white or black or Asian or African. Doesn't matter. If he's the best person, we pick him, right? Now, two of the world's most important international economic organizations are the IMF and the World Bank. In theory, they serve the world. So anybody in the world should qualify to run the IMF and the World Bank. And I can tell you, at one moment when the West felt very vulnerable, at the height of the 2008 financial crisis, when people in the US and Europe began to think, what's happening to us, what's happening to us? When you suddenly needed the rest of the world to come together to save the world economy, you had a G20 meeting in the UK chaired by Gordon Brown, and you said at that meeting, from now on, the leaders of IMF and the World Bank must be chosen on merit. 2008 is 18 years ago. 18 years have passed. Even now, to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And 88% of the world's population don't qualify to run a world's institution. Now, that is so unwise. So unwise. These are supposed to be global institutions. Why do you insist that only Westerners can run it? Why do you say only 12% of the world can run the world's institutions? Clearly, these are decisions made by your leaders. And all these decisions will come to haunt you as the world changes now.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.
看完马凯硕这场在欧洲面向西方精英的现场演讲，心里的感慨远不止几句批判那么简单。很多人看完第一反应，只记住了他当面戳破西方傲慢、痛斥双重标准的犀利发言。但如果只停留在情绪层面，其实会错过整场演讲最核心、最有长远价值的底层逻辑。马凯硕不是单纯站在亚洲视角指责西方，他是用几十年穿梭东西方、常驻联合国安理会的亲身经历，把过去200年的世界秩序、未来几十年的全球格局完整摊开给台下的欧美听众，也摊开给屏幕前的我们。我们先顺着演讲里的3条主线，把西方一步步走向认知盲区的全过程重新梳理一遍，才能真正看懂当下世界正在发生的巨变。第一条， 就是冷战结束后席卷整个西方的历史终结论，幻想也是所有战略失误的根源。1990年冷战落幕，苏联解体，西方不费一枪一弹取得对峙胜利，整个欧美社会从上到下陷入一种前所未有的狂欢。所有人都笃定，自由民主制度是人类社会发展的终极形态，全世界所有国家最终都会抛弃自身文明的发展路径，全盘复制欧美的社会、经济、政治模式。这里有一组被绝大多数西方人刻意忽略的基础数据。全球人口里，西方所有国家加起来只占 12%， 剩余 88% 的人口分布在亚洲、非洲、拉丁美洲，承载着人类历史上绝大多数古老文明。可当时的西方知识分子完全无视这最基础的人口结构，凭空产生一种独属于他们的优越感。马凯硕1991到1992年在哈佛大学访学，亲身浸泡在这种氛围里。他说那段时间随处能听见一种论调，西方已经抵达人类发展顶峰，剩下世界各国只能被动追赶，主动模仿，适应西方定下的所有规则。这种傲慢不是少数政客的想法，而是高校学者、媒体从业者、商界精英统一的共识，深深扎根在西方主流认知里。最致命的问题在于，这份集体自大刚好撞上非西方文明集体复苏的关键节点。1979年，中国正式开启全面现代化建设，依靠贴合自身国情的发展道路稳步前行。到90年代初，经济增长、民生改善的势头已经无法阻挡。几乎同一时间，印度也走出经济危机。放开市场寻求发展，两个拥有数千年文明底蕴、人口体量庞大的大国同步觉醒，本应是西方调整全球战略、重新审视世界的关键信号。可沉浸在历史终结美梦当中的欧美直接闭上了眼睛，他们先入为主，定下刻板标准，只有西式制度才能实现经济腾飞。所以中国、印度的发展成果，他们从心底不愿承认，甚至长期预判我们的发展模式迟早会崩溃。马凯硕在演讲里专门提到中华文明漫长的发展脉络，4000年文明长河里，近200年的落后只是一段短暂的特殊时期。在绝大多数人类历史阶段，中国的经济、文化综合实力都稳居世界前列。如今我们重回发展快车道，本质只是文明回归原本的历史位置，并不是所谓崛起带来威胁。但西方媒体、政界长期刻意淡化这段历史，只用近200年的强弱差距定义东西方天然带着俯视他国的心态，这也是东西方之间长久误解的根源。演讲里讲到的第二个致命错误，是冷战结束30多年，西方愈发泛滥的好战思维，以及白纸黑字摆在面前的国际法双重标准。西方从舆论宣传上一直把自己塑造成和平、法治的文明标杆，反复宣扬联合国宪章是全世界通用的行为准则，可落到实际行动上，规则永远只约束别人，不会约束自己。联合国宪章清晰划定，一国动用武力只有2种合法情形，一是遭遇武装袭击开展自卫，二是获得联合国安理会全体授权。可过去30多年3场大规模军事干预全部踩碎这2条底线。90年代末轰炸贝尔格莱德，没有自卫前提，没有安理会投票授权，属于完全非法的军事行动。当时国际刑事法庭有检察官想要公开核查这场轰炸的合法性，却遭受来自西方各界铺天盖地的施压。这件事在西方主流媒体极少报道，几乎没有民众知情，但全球其他国家全都看在眼里。2003年伊拉克战争更是马凯硕亲眼见证的事件。他当时任职联合国安理会2年，全程跟进所有辩论，美英极力游说各国支持动武，法国、德国2个核心西方盟友都明确反对，全世界多数国家也投出反对意见。可美英依旧绕过安理会单方面开战。战争结束后，没有找到所谓大规模杀伤性武器，数十万平民死于战火，国家基础设施彻底摧毁，地区战乱延续至今。再到后来的利比亚干预行动，同样的剧本再次上演。卡扎菲政权确实存在独裁的问题，这点马凯硕没有回避， 但客观数据摆在利比亚当时的民生层面，全民保障基础收入、免费医疗、普及义务教育，国内长期没有大规模战乱，是非洲民众生活水平靠前的国家。西方发动空袭推翻原有政权之后，直接抽身离开，利比亚彻底沦为失败国家，分裂武装冲突。难民问题持续数十年，给当地民众带去无尽苦难。最讽刺的是，每一次战后，西方内部都极少开展全面反思，媒体更多渲染输出民主的口号，刻意淡化战争带来的人道主义灾难。马凯硕举了一个极具代表性的小故事。2002年，他在纽约高端俱乐部参加午宴，邻座一位顶尖美国商人，仅因为法国、德国反对伊拉克战争，就拒绝饮用法国红酒。一件生活小事就能直观看出战争思维非黑即白的对立认知，已经深度渗透普通西方民众，不是少数政客的独有想法。一边大肆轰炸他国城市，一边标榜自己热爱和平。这种割裂的认知让全球发展中国家彻底看清西方的双重标准，也一点点消耗西方积攒多年的国际公信力。第三大战略失误是西方死死攥住全球核心经济机构的控制权，嘴上宣扬择优录取、多元平等，行动上牢牢守住霸权特权。IMF 国际货币基金组织、世界银行是调节全球经济、帮扶发展中国家最重要两大国际机构，理论上服务全世界。负责人选拔应当只看能力，不分国籍、文明、地域。2008年全球金融危机爆发，欧美经济遭受重创，急需新兴国家联手稳定全球市场。当年 G20 峰会上，戈登施布朗牵头，西方各国共同承诺，未来两大机构负责人完全依照能力选拔，不再设置国际门槛。可承诺过去10几年，规则没有半点改变。时至今日 ，IMF 总裁必须由欧洲人出任，世界银行行长只能是美国人。全球 88% 的人口直接失去竞争两大机构最高职位的资格。西方一边在各国宣扬精英治理、人人平等的价值观，一边在全球核心经济平台设置排他性国际壁垒，两套标准自相矛盾。马凯硕直言，这种短视的霸权思维会长期反噬西方自身。随着新兴经济体经济实力、国际话语权持续提升，这种不公平的制度安排会让越来越多国家对现有西方主导的国际体系失去信任。多元化全新合作机制不断诞生，旧体系的话语权只会持续萎缩。梳理完西方三大根本性战略失误之后，我们再来看演讲后半段重点阐述的时代大势。单一西方主导的时代彻底落幕，多元文明并存的新世界正在成型。过去200多年，依托工业革命先发优势，西方掌握经济、军事、舆论、国际规则全部主导权，全世界被迫适应西方制定的一切标准。但如今格局已经彻底扭转，不只是中国，印度、东南亚各国、中东、拉美新兴国家经济持续增长，各大古老文明重新找回自身文化自信，不会再全盘照搬西方的发展模式。每个国家都会结合自身历史、文化、国情，走出独属于自己的现代化道路。很多西方政界、媒体刻意将中国的发展塑造成威胁，马凯硕直接点破背后隐藏的深层偏见，也就是流传100年的黄祸论。130年前美国出台排华法案，根源就是对东方文明无来由的恐惧。这种刻板印象没有彻底消失，悄悄藏在当下西方很多政客民众的认知深处。如今欧盟部分高官公开发表贬低、妖魔化中国的言论，完全无视中欧经济体量逐步持平的客观现实。明明双方经贸深度绑定，却依旧用傲慢俯视的态度看待中国发展，本质就是无法接受非西方文明重回世界中心舞台。不少人会觉得这番发言过于尖锐，但马凯硕从来没有全盘否定西方，他只是要求西方学会平视世界。过去几百年，西方依靠工业革命抢占先机，收获了长期红利。可时代已经彻底改变，单一中心的全球体系再也无法维系，人口体量、经济规模、文明底蕴，多种力量正在重新平衡世界格局。无视变化，固守傲慢， 最后只会让自己不断落后。同时，我们也要客观理性看待这场演讲。马凯硕的观点站在中立外交视角，不带有极端对立的情绪，只是把长期被西方媒体掩盖的客观现实摆上台面。我们不用因此产生对立思维，更该读懂其中的道理。文明没有高低优劣之分，适合自身历史国情的发展道路才是最优的道路。西方模式不是唯一标准答案，各国都有权走出属于自己的现代化道路。好了，这期视频到这里差不多就要结束了。制作完整长视频搜集史料，核对演讲原文耗费了大量时间。如果本期内容你看得有所收获，欢迎点赞、收藏、转发。